Chen smoothed the lapels of her sensible tweed jacket, a nervous habit she'd cultivated whenever a new project, however daunting, presented itself. This one, however, felt different. It hummed with a peculiar, almost static energy, even before she'd stepped foot inside. The email from the colleague had been terse, formal, outlining a task of such monumental scale it had initially made her professional curiosity prickle with an almost giddy excitement. A private collection, vast and uncatalogued, housed in a forgotten wing of a defunct cinema. Her specialty was organization, the meticulous imposition of order upon chaos, and this promised to be the ultimate test. The Agent Orpheum, once a beacon of silver screen glamour, now stood like a mausoleum to a forgotten era. A guard, the figure facade, once pristine, was now streaked with grime, the elaborate plasterwork crumbling at the edges. A single faded marquee proclaimed, "Closed indefinitely." The main doors, heavy oak beasts, remained firmly shut. Her instructions had directed her to a side entrance, an unassuming metal door tucked away down a narrow, shadowed alleyway, smelling faintly of damp concrete and something indefinably old. The key, an anachronistic iron relic, was heavy in her hand. It turned with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the very foundations of the building. Inside, a narrow, unlit corridor stretched before her, leading deeper into the building's forgotten anatomy. Her footsteps echoed loudly on the bare concrete, each sound swallowed by the profound silence that clung to the air like dust. She found the switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life overhead, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew, decaying paper, and something else. A faint, earthy aroma, like undisturbed soil or ancient wood. The corridor opened into what must have once been a service area, a labyrinth of storerooms and disused offices. Her map, a hand-drawn sketch included in the email, led her through this maze, past stacks of rotting film canisters and forgotten projector parts, until she reached another door. This one was even more substantial, made of dark, unvarnished wood, reinforced with iron bands, as if designed to keep something in, or perhaps out. It was marked only with a small, brass plaque. The Annex. A person a deep breath, Chen pushed it open. The sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. This was no mere room. It was a cavernous space, stretching further than she could discern in the dim light. What light there was filtered in grudgingly from a series of high, grimy windows near the distant ceiling, casting weak, dusty beams through the gloom. The air here was even colder, stiller, weighted down by the sheer volume of things. The Dr. Oz collection. It defied easy description. It wasn't merely books, though towering, haphazard stacks of volumes, many bound in leather or strange, rough fabrics, rose like crooked obelisks from the floor. It wasn't merely artifacts, though glass display cases, their contents obscured by years of dust, lined what passed for walls. It was an overwhelming, suffocating accumulation of everything. A witness crates, some open to reveal their unsettling contents, were piled high. Officer brass instruments, their functions inscrutable, glinted dimly. Detective creatures, their glass eyes staring blankly into the perpetual twilight, perched precariously on shelves or lurked in shadowed corners. Scrolls, brittle with age, lay unfurled on makeshift tables cobbled together from more crates. A specialist motes danced in the sparse light, forming shimmering columns that gave the impression of a slow, deliberate snowfall within the annex. Chen, a woman who prided herself on her composure and her ability to bring order to even the most chaotic archives, felt a tremor of something akin to awe, mixed with a nascent, unsettling dread. The scale of it was beyond anything she had ever encountered. This wasn't just a collection. It was a sprawling, multi-layered archaeological dig into one man's obsessive psyche. Her hand went to the small, leather-bound notebook in her pocket. Her meticulous planner, usually filled with precise schedules and color-coded tasks, Here, it felt laughably inadequate. Where would she even begin? The sheer volume was a physical presence, pressing in on her from all sides, a silent, ancient roar. The silence, in fact, was the most profound sensation. A technician, the heavy annex door swung shut behind her with a soft thud. The outside world ceased to exist. No distant city hum, no traffic, not even the creak of the old cinema structure. A colleague, the annex, and her. She was utterly, completely alone. A profound, almost spiritual solitude settled over her, chilling her to the bone even through her sensible jacket. The Dr. Is world, entombed within this forgotten wing, was now her world too, and it was vast, silent, and deeply, deeply strange. The excitement of the challenge was still there, but now it was tinged with a disquieting sense of being swallowed whole. Chen spent the next morning immersed in the musty archives, determined to make headway on the theater's history. The air, thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten dreams, was unusually still. She cataloged old programs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and faded photographs of smiling vaudeville performers, their eyes now holding the sepia-toned gaze of the long dead. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of the building settling around her. She was in the former manager's office, a small wood-paneled room adjacent to the main stage, when the first anomaly occurred. The single bare bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, its filament a fragile coil, flickered. Once, then twice, casting dancing shadows that stretched and shrank across the walls like grasping hands. Chen paused, pen hovering over her notepad. "Old wiring," she murmured, more to herself than the empty room. "This place is a fire hazard waiting to happen." She made a mental note to check the electrical system. A few hours later, as she sifted through a box of dusty ledgers, a sudden sharp drop in temperature made her shiver. It wasn't a general chill. It was a distinct, localized pocket of cold that seemed to cling to her back, raising gooseflesh on her arms. She hugged her tweed jacket tighter, rubbing her arms. "Drafty old building," she rationalized, glancing toward the sealed window. "Probably a vent I haven't spotted yet." The cold spot lingered for a moment longer before dissipating, leaving her feeling inexplicably vulnerable. The feeling of being watched began subtly, a prickling sensation on her neck that she initially dismissed as fatigue. But it persisted, growing in intensity as the afternoon wore on. Every time she looked up from her work, her eyes darting to the open doorway, the dark corners of the room, or the heavy velvet curtains that separated the office from the stage, there was nothing. A colleague, the silence, the dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through the grime-streaked window. Yet the sensation was undeniable, as if unseen eyes were tracking her every move. Their presence, a silent, suffocating weight. She found herself checking behind her, peering into the gloom of the adjacent stage, her heart thumping a little faster than usual. "Ridiculous," she muttered, forcing herself to focus on a ledger detailing ticket sales from 1937. "It's just the quiet and the sheer size of this place." But the quiet wasn't truly quiet. As dusk began to bleed through the high windows, painting the dust with hues of bruised purple and gray, faint whispers began to insinuate themselves into the silence. They were formless, breathy sounds, like a multitude of voices speaking just beyond the threshold of hearing. They seemed to emanate from the empty corners of the office, from the shadowy expanse of the stage beyond, even from the very walls themselves. Chen strained to decipher them, tilting her head, but they remained just out of reach, a maddening, indistinct murmur that raised the hairs on her arms. An agent at the wind? The building settling? The ancient pipes groaning? She couldn't be sure, but the sound filled her with a profound, growing dread. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a secret conversation she wasn't meant to overhear. a chorus of spectral voices recounting ancient grievances. She pushed back from the desk, needing to move, to break the spell of the unsettling sounds. Her gaze fell upon an ornate, but somewhat dilapidated mahogany writing desk in the corner of the office. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A guard there were more records inside. She pulled open the main drawer. It was empty, save for a few desiccated spider webs. As she went to close it, her fingers brushed against something odd. A slight give in the bottom. Frowning, she pushed harder. A figure, a soft click. A section of the drawer's base slid inward, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. A person lay a single leather-bound book. It was small, no bigger than her palm, with a clasp that had long since rusted shut. The leather was deeply scuffed, its surface worn smooth in places, as if handled constantly. There was no title, no author listed on the spine. Chen's fingers trembled slightly as she pried open the clasp with the tip of her pen. The pages within were filled with cramped, meticulous handwriting, not in English, nor any language she immediately recognized. It was a complex series of symbols, diagrams, and what looked like a personal code. The Dr. S. journal. She knew it instinctively. The whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around her, as if the very air itself was alive with unseen presence, reacting to her discovery. The dread that had been a slow burn all day now flared into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. This was more than just an old building. This was a secret, a buried truth, and she had just opened its door. Chen spent the next morning immersed in the musty archives, determined to make headway on the theater's history. The air, thick with the scent of decaying paper and settled dust, pressed in on her, a physical weight that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. She sifted through ledgers, playbills, and yellowed newspaper clippings, piecing together a timeline of triumphs and failures. But nothing truly resonated. The grand narratives felt hollow, missing the pulse of the building she now inhabited. It was tucked away, almost deliberately obscured, behind a stack of brittle programs for a forgotten operetta. A small, leather-bound book, its cover scuffed and its pages dog-eared, with no title, no author, just a faint, almost invisible inscription on the spine. Finch. Curiosity, a potent force she often struggled to control, tugged at her. She pulled it free, the leather surprisingly cool beneath her fingertips. It was a journal, handwritten in a spidery, elegant script that suggested a meticulous mind. Yet the ink bled in places, betraying moments of haste or agitation. Chen settled back, pushing aside the mundane historical records, and opened Finch's journal. The first entries were prosaic enough. Observations on the theater's structural integrity, notes on specific performances, and complaints about the dwindling audience. Finch, it seemed, had been a diligent, if somewhat pedantic, stage manager in the early 20th century. But then, a shift. The language grew richer, the observations less about practicalities and more about atmosphere. A colleague began to detail his growing fascination with the theater's hidden corners, the echoes he heard in empty corridors, the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen even in full light. His entries started to reference obscure folklore, local legends whispered among the stagehands, tales of hungry spirits and unquiet presences tied to specific locations. Chen felt a prickle on her arms, a phantom chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. Finch's meticulous hand then delved into forgotten rituals, fragments of ceremonies intended to appease, to banish, or, most disturbingly, to invite. He spoke of the veil between worlds thinning in certain liminal spaces, and how the theater, with its constant interplay of illusion and reality, was a prime candidate. He specifically fixated on the annex, describing it as a nexus, a place where a presence had taken root, a sentience that observed, that waited. As Chen read, her own surroundings seemed to subtly warp. A stack of archived playbills, perfectly aligned moments before, now sat askew, as if a careless hand had brushed them. She glanced up, scanning the shelves, the empty desk across from her. Nothing. The oppressive silence of the archive. She dismissed it as her imagination, a product of Finch's increasingly unsettling narrative. But the dread, a cold, creeping sensation, began to gnaw at her focus. It was a pervasive feeling, not sharp and sudden, but a dull, insistent ache in her chest, a sense of being perpetually on the verge of something terrible. Her eyes darted to the periphery of her vision. Had that shadow in the corner just deepened? Had the faint outline of the coat rack in the far corner just moved? No, it was just the dim light, the dust motes dancing. Finch's entries grew more frantic. He detailed his attempts to communicate with the presence, his belief that it fed on attention, on emotion. He described subtle phenomena mirroring Chen's own fleeting observations. Objects disappearing and reappearing, whispers carried on non-existent breezes, the distinct feeling of being watched, of breath on his neck in an empty room. Chen's heart hammered against her ribs. She was reading Finch's descent into obsession, yet it felt as though she was experiencing it herself, the lines blurring between his past and her present. A loose page in the journal, brittle with age, fluttered to the floor. As she bent to retrieve it, she noticed her pen, which she had left uncapped beside the journal, was now lying several inches away, pointing directly at the open page, as if deliberately placed to draw her attention. Her breath hitched. This wasn't imagination. This was too specific. A cold, heavy weight settled in the pit of her stomach. She looked around the archive, her gaze lingering on the closed door, the high, grimy windows. She was alone, utterly alone, yet the air felt thick with unseen eyes. Finch's words, once a historical curiosity, now felt like a personal warning, a shared experience across the decades. He spoke of the presence learning, adapting, becoming more psychological in its torment, preying on fears, on isolation. Chen felt her grip tighten on the journal, the leather warm now as if it held a living heat. She wanted to put it down, to walk away, to return to the comforting banality of financial ledgers. But she couldn't. Finch's obsession had become her own, a dark, magnetic pull that demanded she uncover every last word. She had to know what happened to him, what he had truly unleashed in the echoing halls of the old cinema. And with every word, the pervasive dread deepened, wrapping itself around her. A cold, intimate embrace. The morning had bled into afternoon, and still, Chen remained buried in the archives. The initial thrill of discovery had given way to a methodical, almost desperate search for answers. She'd made progress, tracing the theater's ownership from its grand opening through a series of less illustrious proprietors. But the deeper she delved, the more the factual history seemed to thin, replaced by whispers and gaps that Finch's later entries hinted at with unnerving frequency. The scent of decaying paper and dust, once comforting, now felt like the breath of something ancient and suffocating. She'd pushed past the meticulously catalogued boxes, venturing into a section marked simply, Finch, Unsorted. It was here, tucked beneath a stack of brittle playbills from the 1930s, that she found it. A small, leather-bound ledger, distinct from the larger, more official journals. Its cover was blank, its pages thin and foxed, filled with Finch's tight, almost frantic script. This wasn't history. This was personal. As she opened it, a faint metallic tang, like old blood or forgotten iron, seemed to prickle the air. Chen dismissed it as the archives playing tricks on her senses, a side effect of too much stagnant air and too little sleep. She began to read, her fingers tracing Finch's hurried words. A colleague entries were different. They spoke not of architectural details or ticket sales, but of thin places, of veils between, and increasingly, of observations. Finch wrote of a growing sensation, a presence that had coalesced in the theater, particularly within the stage wings and the upper boxes. He detailed chilling accounts of flickering lights, of phantom whispers that grew clearer with each passing night, and of shadows that moved with a life of their own. "The air grows heavy," one entry read, dated just weeks before his disappearance. "The barrier thins. Chen feel it pressing, a cold, hungry awareness. It watches from the darkness, a formless grief given shape by the theater's sorrow. It craves recognition." Chen felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. This wasn't historical research. This was the fevered rambling of a man obsessed. Yet a part of her, the part that had felt the chill in the empty auditorium and heard the distant, echoing thud, couldn't entirely dismiss it. She turned a page, her breath catching in her throat. Finch had sketched something here. A crude but disturbing drawing of a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its head bowed, its body draped in what looked like heavy, tattered fabric. There were no discernible features, just an empty space where a face should be, and long, spindly hands that seemed to reach out from the page. "A agent it," Finch had scrawled in capital letters. "The widow. It weeps for what was lost. It wants to be seen." As Chen stared at the drawing, the silence of the archives deepened to an almost painful pressure. The motes of dust dancing in the narrow beam of light from the high window seemed to slow, hang, suspended. A profound cold seeped into the air, not the usual damp chill of an old building, but an icy, pervasive dread that sank into her bones. Her breath plumed faintly before her. Then she saw it. At the very end of the narrow aisle, where the stacks of forgotten theater programs dissolved into shadow, a shape began to coalesce. It was faint at first, like a trick of her tired eyes, a ripple in the stagnant air. Chen blinked, rubbing her temples, convinced it was a visual artifact, a phantom limb of her own exhaustion. But it didn't vanish. Instead, it solidified. A tall, impossibly slender figure, draped in what looked like heavy, moth-eaten velvet, began to emerge from the gloom. Its head was bowed, just as in Finch's drawing, obscuring any features. Yet Chen felt an intense, crushing weight of sorrow emanating from it. A palpable grief that seemed to leach the warmth from the very air. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against her sternum. She squeezed her eyes shut, then snapped them open again, desperate to dispel the horrifying image. It remained, unmoving, silent, but utterly present. The figure was cloaked in black, but the fabric wasn't just dark. It seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a void. The hands, long and skeletal, emerged from the voluminous sleeves, clasped together at its waist, as if in perpetual mourning. And then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the head began to lift. Chen couldn't breathe. She was frozen, a terrified spectator in her own nightmare. As the head rose, she saw it wasn't a face that emerged from the shadows of the hood, but a gaping, empty darkness. A void where eyes and mouth should be. A blackness that seemed to pull at her own consciousness, threatening to swallow her whole. A strangled gasp tore from Chen's throat. The ledger slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering to the dusty floor. The sound, amplified in the profound silence, seemed to shatter the spectral tableau. The figure, with an almost imperceptible ripple, receded. It didn't disappear instantly, but rather faded, dissolving back into the oppressive shadows from which it had come, leaving behind only the lingering, bone-deep cold and an unbearable sense of loss. Chen stumbled backward, colliding with a towering shelf of play scripts. A guard rained down on her, mingling with the cold sweat beading on her forehead. Her mind reeled, grasping for a rational explanation. A trick of light? A hallucination? Fatigue? But the cold, the sheer oppressive sorrow, the horrifying clarity of the figure. It had been too real, too vivid, too terrifyingly present. Finch's words screamed in her mind. It wants to be seen. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. This wasn't a draft, or a strange echo, or a bump in the night. This was a glimpse behind the veil, a direct confrontation with the unimaginable. Finch hadn't been delusional. He had been a witness. And now, so was she. The theater wasn't just old and neglected. It was a cage, or perhaps a conduit for something utterly terrifying. Chen stared at the empty space where the figure had been, her world tilting precariously. Her sanity, once a solid anchor, now felt like a fragile thread stretched taut over an abyss. Methodical, almost desperate hunt for anything that could explain the unsettling occurrences within the old cinema. The morning had bled into afternoon, and still, Chen remained buried in the archives. The initial thrill of discovery had given way to a methodical, almost desperate hunt for anything that could explain the unsettling occurrences within the old cinema. She started with the doctor. The name echoed in her mind, a phantom whisper from the hidden annex. She scoured digital databases of local historical societies, university archives, and even obscure genealogical sites. The results were maddeningly sparse. Dr. A. Colleague Finch, a notable figure in early 20th century architectural preservation, credited with several significant restorations. A few dry academic papers, a brief obituary. An agent about his personal life, nothing about the cinema annex beyond a passing mention of its completion in 1932. A final project before his sudden, unexplained disappearance the following year. Disappearance. The word hung in the air, heavy and unaddressed. Every attempt to dig deeper hit a wall. A guard were incomplete, files mysteriously corrupted, or simply non-existent. It was as if a meticulous hand had swept through history, erasing any inconvenient details. A figure simmered, then boiled. Chen moved to the cinema itself, the Majestic, built in 1928. A person grand opening, its heyday, its decline. A witness there, in crisp black and white photographs and newspaper clippings. But the annex? A phantom limb of history. A few blueprints showed an expansion, a private wing, but no specific purpose was ever detailed. The records of its construction were vague, the contractors unlisted, the materials sourced from unknown suppliers. It was a blank space in the city's meticulously kept history, a void that hummed with a silent, insistent wrongness. Each dead end felt less like an oversight and more like a deliberate act of obfuscation. An officer, she's simply incompetent? Or was something actively hindering her? A cold dread began to coil in her stomach, a familiar sensation she'd tried to rationalize away. She shifted her focus, abandoning official channels for the murky waters of local folklore. Old community forums, obscure history blogs, forgotten microfiches of small-town newspapers from decades past. Here, the silence surrounding the annex began to fracture, replaced by whispers. Vague, unsettling tales of the Majestic. A detective about its glory, but about its shadows. A specialist of patrons who swore the cinema felt cold even in summer. Of projectionists who heard whispers from empty booths. Of strange, fleeting reflections in the gilded mirrors of the lobby. There were mentions, too, of a cursed wing. A part of the building where shadows seemed to deepen and sounds were swallowed. One particularly unsettling forum post, dated from 2003 and riddled with typos, spoke of the architect who vanished into his own creation, and the silence that eats. No names, no dates, just fragmented, unsettling illusions that painted a picture of a place steeped in an inexplicable dread. This was the only information that seemed to stick, the only threads that didn't immediately unravel in her hands. It was as if the entity, in its insidious way, was allowing her to find only what further destabilized her, what pushed her closer to the brink of belief. A technician by a desperate need to ground herself, to hear a rational voice, Chen decided to confide in a colleague. She found Michael, a fellow archivist in the break room, nursing a lukewarm coffee. "Michael," she began, trying to keep her voice even. "I've been working on the colleague files, and there are some things that don't add up." She recounted her findings, the missing records, the unsettling legends, the feeling of being actively blocked in her research. An agent listened, his expression shifting from polite interest to a mild, almost pitying concern. "Chen, you've been putting in some serious hours on that project," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Maybe you're just a little overtired. Old buildings always have gaps in their records and local legends. Well, they're just stories, right? You're seeing patterns where there aren't any." He offered a kind, dismissive smile. "Why don't you take a break, guard some fresh air?" His words, meant to reassure, only reinforced her isolation. She tried another colleague, then another, each conversation ending with the same polite dismissal, the same suggestions of stress or overwork. Their eyes, though kind, held a distant concern, as if she were teetering on the edge of something they couldn't quite grasp. It was like shouting into a void, the words swallowed before they could even register. The entity, she realized with a chilling certainty, wasn't just manipulating the files. It was manipulating perceptions, weaving a silent barrier between her and anyone who might offer a lifeline. A figure to her desk, the screen glowed, mocking her with its endless, fruitless search results. The fragmented legends swirled in her mind, mingling with the chilling silence of the official records. She felt utterly alone, an island of escalating dread in a sea of polite skepticism. The cinema, the annex, Dr. A person. They were a puzzle she couldn't solve, a truth she couldn't grasp, always just beyond her reach. And somewhere, in the deepening shadows of her mind, the entity watched, its unseen presence growing stronger, feeding on her doubt, her isolation, and her burgeoning terror. She was being led, not to answers, but deeper into its labyrinth. Chen's methodical, almost desperate hunt for anything that could explain the unsettling occurrences within the old cinema had bled from morning into a long, shadows-creeping afternoon. A colleague motes danced in the anemic light filtering through the grime-streaked windows of Finch's annex, each particle a silent witness to the man's unraveling. She had sifted through ledgers detailing ancient film reels, stacks of forgotten playbills, and countless loose notes scrawled in Finch's precise, looping hand. Nothing. A agent the mundane records of a life lived in obsessive isolation. A guard gnawed at her, a sharper hunger than her own unmet need for food. She pushed aside a stack of dusty periodicals, revealing a small, unassuming wooden box tucked into a deeper recess of the shelf. It was plain, unadorned, and felt heavier than its size suggested. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single leather-bound journal. It was unlike the others she'd found, thicker, its cover strangely rigid, almost swollen. She'd overlooked it before, dismissing it as just another, more robust ledger. A figure, her fingers along its spine, Chen noticed a faint seam where the leather seemed to buckle slightly. Pressure, a specific twist, and a tiny, almost invisible latch clicked. The cover didn't open. Instead, a slim, shallow compartment was revealed within its very thickness. Inside, folded and brittle with age, were several loose sheets of parchment, covered in Finch's familiar script, but overlaid with strange symbols and what appeared to be a complex self-devised cipher. Her heart began to thump a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the hidden truth. A person blurred into a singular, intense focus. Chen carefully unfolded the fragile pages, laying them out on Finch's scarred desk. She remembered a small, almost throwaway note she'd found earlier, a cryptic reference to the language of the deep echo. She cross-referenced symbols, patterns, and repeated phrases, her mind racing to connect the dots. The air in the annex grew heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Slowly, painstakingly, the cipher yielded. The first coherent sentences solidified in her mind, sending a chill that had nothing to do with the encroaching evening air. It is not a spirit, not a ghost, but a primal hunger. It has no form save the void it leaves. Chen call it the deep echo. Chen's breath hitched. The deep echo. The name resonated with a chilling finality. Finch's notes detailed its ancient origins, not as something that came from beyond the stars, but as something intrinsically tied to the very earth beneath the cinema. It was a primordial entity, a resonance of the land's forgotten past, a vast silent maw that had always existed, predating the town, the very concept of human settlement. It was a fissure in reality, a psychic void that had lain dormant, stirring only when the conditions were right. And the cinema, with its dark, insulated rooms, its projector beam a hypnotic lure, had provided those conditions. The next pages revealed its horrifying method of sustenance. The deep echo did not consume flesh, but the essence of consciousness. It latched onto minds, particularly those isolated, vulnerable, or lost in the flickering illusions of the screen. It absorbed knowledge, memories, identity, the very spark of life force, leaving behind only an empty shell, a hollowed-out vessel. Finch described the process with a chilling clinical detachment, then with a growing, perverse fascination. The initial draining. It is a sublime emptiness, a quiet oblivion. Then the hunger intensifies, and one feels oneself pulled apart, thought by thought, memory by memory, until nothing remains but the profound, terrifying stillness. It is a cleansing, a purification. Chen's blood ran cold. The disappearances, the strange lethargy, the forgotten faces. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a feeding. The cinema wasn't just a place of entertainment. It was a carefully constructed trap, a psychic abattoir. A witness came the most damning, most terrifying revelation. Finch wasn't just studying it. He was tending to it. He had discovered the deep echo inadvertently, perhaps during the cinema's construction, or in one of his delves into its forgotten history. In his obsessive pursuit of understanding, of knowledge beyond the mundane, he hadn't merely observed. He had become its willing acolyte, its shepherd. They come, drawn to the light, to the stories. They offer themselves, unknowingly. And Chen. Chen guide them. Chen tend to the maw. It gives him insights. It whispers the truths of forgotten ages, the echoes of the minds it consumes. Chen am not its victim. Chen am its keeper, a officer conduit, its provider. Finch's later entries, scrawled with a manic intensity, spoke of a perverse pride in his role, a terrifying acceptance of the horror he facilitated. He rationalized it as a necessary exchange, a way to access profound, terrible truths. He had become less a man and more a grotesque extension of the entity itself, feeding it, nurturing it, ensuring its continued existence. He wasn't trapped. He was complicit. He wasn't a victim. He was a perpetrator. The last page was not a cipher, but a single stark sentence, written in a hand that trembled with a chilling blend of triumph and despair. Now the seeker has found him. The maw awaits its next truth. Chen dropped the brittle parchment as if scalded. The silence of the annex was no longer just empty. It was pregnant with unseen hunger. The flickering shadows now seemed to writhe, to reach. She was alone, isolated in the heart of the beast, having uncovered its darkest secret. Finch had not just left a journal. He had left a message. And she, in her desperate search for answers, had walked straight into the waiting mouth of the deep echo. She was not an observer anymore. She was the next offering. Chen's methodical, almost desperate hunt for anything that could explain the unsettling occurrences within the old cinema had bled from morning into a timeless, placeless eternity. The moment of understanding, of piecing together the true, horrifying nature of the presence within these walls. Not a ghost, not a poltergeist, but something far more insidious, a devourer of minds, had been a silent scream. And in that silence, it had known. It had felt her realization, a flicker of comprehension in the vast, empty halls of its ancient hunger. The air, already heavy, grew dense, pressing in on her. The dusty light filtering through unseen windows in the annex twisted, becoming sickly yellow, then a bruised purple. The walls themselves seemed to ripple, the faded wallpaper patterns shifting like skin beneath a fever dream. Chen stumbled, her hand reaching out for a solid surface, only for the rough plaster to dissolve into a swirling vortex of shadows and indistinct whispering faces. You know? A voice, not heard but felt, slithered into her mind. It was a chorus of agony, a symphony of forgotten screams, yet perfectly articulate. And knowing is the first step. The annex, once merely dilapidated, became a living labyrinth. A colleague elongated impossibly. Doors she swore were there vanished, replaced by solid brick or gaping, lightless voids. The floor beneath her feet buckled and swelled, like the deck of a ship caught in a storm, but a storm of pure hallucination. She tried to retrace her steps, to find the projection booth, the archives, anything familiar, but every turn led her deeper into a landscape of her own unraveling psyche. A agent came the memories. They didn't just flash, they rewrote themselves. She remembered a different childhood, a different family, a different life where she was someone else entirely. A librarian, a circus performer, a silent gray figure perpetually tending to an endless dark collection. Her own past, the one she clutched onto like a lifeline, began to fray. Had she always been Chen? Was her name even Chen? The thought was a cold, alien hand reaching into her chest, squeezing her heart. Who are you? The collective voice purred, closer now, echoing from every surface. What defines you, little archivist? Your name? Your memories? Your will? A guard materialized with brutal clarity. The dusty seats of the forgotten auditorium now held grotesque, skeletal figures, their eyes empty sockets, their mouths agape in silent, eternal shrieks. They were not just phantoms. They felt present, their cold breath on her neck, their desiccated fingers brushing her hair. She saw her own reflection in a shattered shard of glass, but it was twisted, her features dissolving into a mask of fear, then morphing into the gaunt, perpetually surprised face of one of the archival bodies she'd discovered earlier. A shudder ripped through her. Was this what it wanted? To wear her skin? To turn her into another one of its silent, hollow observers? The air itself began to hum with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in her bones, threatening to shake her apart. It was a sound designed to dismantle, to shatter the very framework of her sanity. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound was internal, resonating from within the core of her being. "Join us," the entity whispered, its voice now a singular hypnotic drone, yet still composed of 1,000 dying echoes. "Become part of the collection. Witness the truth of all things endlessly. You will no longer be alone. You will be complete." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation, coded in the most profound horror. It wanted her consciousness, her unique perspective, to add to its horrifying archive of consumed minds, to be absorbed, to exist as a fragment of its eternal, insatiable hunger. Chen stumbled through a doorway that wasn't there a moment ago, finding herself in a vast, cavernous space that was simultaneously the projection booth, the storage room, and the main auditorium, all warped and blended into an impossible geometry. The ceiling stretched into an infinite blackness, punctuated by pinpricks of light that were not stars, but distant, silent screams. A figure pulsed with a sickly, organic rhythm, veins of shadow spreading and contracting. Her head throbbed. Doubt, a corrosive acid, ate at the edges of her resolve. Was there any point in fighting? Was she already lost? Had she always been here, a piece of this vast, dark machinery, merely dreaming of a life outside? The entity's power wasn't just to show her things, but to make her believe them, to dissolve the very foundations of her identity. She clawed at her own arm, the sharp pain a desperate anchor to reality. This is real. Chen am Chen. This is not him. The annex groaned around her, a living beast hungry for her surrender. A wall of spectral hands reached out, beckoning, promising a cessation of the torment, a peaceful oblivion within the collective. But Chen saw the emptiness in their grasp, the hollow promise of eternal servitude. She would not become another blank page in its monstrous ledger. A person yet. Her breath hitched, a raw, ragged sound in the echoing darkness, but her eyes, wide with terror, still burned with a fierce, defiant spark. She would fight. But against what, and for how long, she had no idea. Chen's methodical, almost desperate hunt for anything that could explain the unsettling occurrences within the old cinema had bled from morning into a perpetual twilight, indistinguishable from the gloom that clung to the building's deepest recesses. Her body ached with a profound weariness, but her mind, raw and frayed, refused to yield. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every creak of the ancient structure a mocking whisper. The entity was not just a presence, it was an active predator, relentlessly chipping away at her sanity, filling her with a terror so absolute it threatened to consume her. Yet, amidst the gnawing dread, a stubborn ember of defiance flickered. She would not simply wait to be devoured. Her search had taken her everywhere, from the dusty projection booth where phantom reels spun in her periphery, to the decaying stage where invisible performances played out. Now, driven by a hunch born of sheer exhaustion and a strange, cold clarity, she found herself in the manager's office, a room she'd dismissed earlier as too mundane. It was a chaotic mess of overturned furniture and scattered ledgers, but her eyes, honed by desperation, caught sight of an anomaly. A section of the wall behind a collapsed bookcase that seemed newer, less aged than the rest. A colleague, a surge of adrenaline, Chen tore away the rotten wood of the bookcase. A crudely plastered section of the wall gave way to her insistent prodding. It wasn't a hidden room, but a small, shallow cavity. A guard inside, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, then something rough, like aged leather. She pulled them out. A tarnished brass key, heavy and ornate, and a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover etched with faded, esoteric symbols. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. This was it. This felt like the answer, or at least the beginning of one. The journal was old, its pages brittle and yellowed, filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. It was the diary of the figure Han, the cinema's original owner. Chen's eyes scanned the entries, her breath catching in her throat. Han hadn't just built a cinema. He'd sought to harness the emotional resonance of the audiences, to imbue his films with an almost hypnotic power. He spoke of the person well, a natural confluence of energies beneath the land, and of rituals meant to draw forth the essence for his artistic vision. But something had gone terribly wrong. The later entries devolved into panicked, increasingly unhinged confessions. Han hadn't drawn forth essence. He had torn open a gateway. He had not harnessed power. He had invited a hunger. The entity, he wrote, was not a ghost, but a parasite, a thing without true form, born of the raw, collective emotions that flowed through the cinema, anchored to the very ground it stood upon. A witness-feeding cycle was tied to the presence of an audience, to the heightened states of fear and wonder, though it could now subsist on the lingering echoes of those emotions, growing stronger with each passing year of abandonment. The key, she realized, was for a specific, ancient safe described in the journal, hidden within the cinema's deepest foundation. It was there, Han confessed in his final terrified entry, that he had placed the binding heart. An officer and anchor, but a failed attempt at containment. A grotesque, sculpted effigy of dark wood and human bone, meant to focus and control the entity's power, but which had instead become its primary tether, its conduit to this plane. It was the entity's weakness because it was its connection. Destroy the binding heart, and the entity would be severed, cast back into the void from which it had inadvertently been summoned. The journal didn't stop there. Han, in a final desperate act of self-preservation, had also recorded the Severing Litany, a series of specific incantations and actions required to dismantle the binding heart without being overwhelmed by the entity's backlash. This was the forbidden knowledge. Not just how to destroy it, but how to do so without becoming its next, permanent host. Chen felt a chilling clarity settle over her. The terror was still a suffocating blanket, but now it was laced with a grim resolve. She understood the immense personal cost. To engage in the detective meant to open herself to the entity's full, unbridled fury, to become a focal point for its rage and despair. It would attack her mind with everything it had, trying to break her, to turn her into another echo in its decaying domain. She might lose herself in the process, her sanity fracturing, her very soul scarred or even consumed. But the alternative was slow, agonizing disintegration. Her hand trembled as she closed the journal, the weight of the ancient knowledge pressing down on her. This was no longer a desperate hunt for answers. It was a desperate plan for survival. She would descend into the foundations of this cursed place, face the binding heart, and sever the entity's connection. Chen took a deep, shuddering breath, the stale air of the cinema burning in her lungs. The fight was coming, and she would meet it head-on. Chen's methodical, almost desperate hunt for anything that could explain the unsettling occurrences within the old cinema had bled from morning into a perpetual twilight, the building's own clock having long since ceased to function. What she had found wasn't a blueprint, nor a diary, but a pattern. A pulse in the static, a hollow echo beneath the floorboards of the annex, a distinct chill that defied explanation. It was the heart of the anomaly, she realized, not a place she could understand, but a wound she might yet cauterize. Her plan, born of exhaustion and a fierce, unyielding resolve, was simple in its terrifying audacity. She would force her way to that heart. A colleague, a heavy wrench she'd found in the projection booth, Chen struck the wall beside the annex's main entrance. Not with anger, but with a deliberate, almost ritualistic intent. The sound reverberated, too loud, too sharp, like a bell rung in a tomb. For a moment, nothing. Then the air thickened, growing viscous and cold, clinging to her skin. The familiar scent of dust and decay deepened, laced now with something metallic, like old blood. She pushed through the double doors, no longer merely entering a part of the cinema, but stepping into the maw itself. The initial corridor was impossibly long, the ceiling curving lower, pressing down on her. The walls, once scarred plaster, now rippled like disturbed water. She moved forward, her steps heavy, the wrench a cold comfort in her hand. A low groan echoed, not from the building's old timbers, but from deep within its structure, a sound that felt like the earth itself shifting. Then the walls began to move. An agent at first, a subtle undulation, then with sickening purpose. The corridor ahead twisted, a straight path becoming a corkscrew, the floor tilting, threatening to throw her off balance. Aguard her. The entrance doors shimmered, then vanished, replaced by an unbroken expanse of undulating wall. Chen pressed on, her breath catching in her throat. The annex was no longer a static structure. It was a living, breathing entity, actively resisting her intrusion. A figure stretched and contracted. Doors appeared and disappeared with disorienting speed. She found herself in a room that had been the old costume department, only for the racks of moth-eaten fabrics to dissolve into a swirling vortex of shadows, their forms coalescing into grotesque, skeletal figures that clawed at the air, their silent screams tearing at her composure. She didn't fight them. Couldn't. She pushed through, her mind screaming at the sheer impossibility, her body aching with the strain of navigating a space that defied all logic. The entity's resistance escalated. A person assaulted her, vivid and terrifying. She saw the faces of the missing, their eyes wide with a silent horror that mirrored her own. She saw herself, broken and defeated, consumed by the shadows that now writhed across every surface. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and the sweet, cloying smell of decay. A sensory assault designed to break her spirit. A chill, more profound than any she had ever known, seeped into her bones, threatening to paralyze her. She felt its presence, vast and ancient, a conscious malevolence that pulsed through the very fabric of the building. It was trying to show her the futility of her efforts, to drown her in despair before she even reached its core. She stumbled into a vast, cavernous space that had once been the storage area, now impossibly vast, the ceiling lost in a perpetual gloom. Amidst the darkness, tendrils of shadow reached out, not quite solid, but possessing a palpable weight that threatened to pull her under. They whispered, a chorus of sibilant voices that clawed at her sanity, twisting her own thoughts into accusations and despair. You are alone. You cannot fight this. Surrender. Her chest burned, her lungs screaming for air that felt thin and cold. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but Chen pushed through the physical agony. The psychological torment was far worse. She was losing her grip, the lines between reality and hallucination blurring into a terrifying, indistinguishable mess. Yet a spark, a defiant ember still glowed within her. This was what she had sought, the entity unmasked, its true power revealed. She was no longer hunting. She was being hunted, trapped in a labyrinth of its own making, a living nightmare designed solely to break her. But she had come too far. The path ahead shimmered, leading deeper into the heart of the annex, into a darkness so profound it seemed to absorb all light, all sound, all hope. The air thrummed with a terrible energy, a pressure that threatened to crush her. Chen raised the wrench, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of her desperate, unyielding will. She took another step, then another, into the maw, into the very core of the entity's power, knowing that retreat was no longer an option, only forward, into the abyss. The cold, damp air in the sub-basement of the old cinema didn't just carry the scent of mildew and decay. It hummed with a deeper, more insidious chill. Chen, guided by a gut instinct that had sharpened into a painful certainty, had descended through a forgotten trapdoor, past crumbling brickwork and rusted pipes, until she stood before a wall that didn't belong. It was a patch of rough, uneven stone, darker than the rest, pulsating faintly with a sensation that made her teeth ache. This was it. The heart. She pressed her palm against the cold surface, and a wave of concentrated dread washed over her. A cacophony of forgotten screams and whispers that clawed at the edges of her sanity. It wasn't just the memory of fear. It was fear itself, distilled and potent. Her hand trembled, but she pushed, applying her full weight. The wall groaned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from within her own chest, and then slowly, agonizingly, it began to give way, grinding inwards like a protesting tomb lid. A colleague it lay not a chamber, but an absence, a void. The space was impossibly dark, a pocket of absolute blackness that seemed to absorb what little light filtered down from the trapdoor above. Yet within that profound gloom, something shifted. It wasn't a shape, not a form she could discern with her eyes. but a swirling vortex of pure, concentrated non-existence. It was the negative space between all things, the hunger behind all fear, the quiet despair that settles in the corners of a forgotten mind. It was the entity's core, and it was awake. As Chen stepped over the threshold, the air thickened, becoming a viscous, suffocating medium. The temperature plummeted, and a profound, bone-deep ache settled into her marrow. This wasn't a physical battle. It was an assault on the very architecture of her being. The first strike was silent, a psychic hammer blow that sent her staggering back. Memories, twisted and grotesque, flashed through her mind. Her own face contorted in agony, the faces of people she loved, screaming, their eyes empty. It wasn't just showing her fears, it was making her feel them as if they were happening right now, tearing at her soul with unseen claws. "No," she rasped, the words stolen by the suffocating pressure. She clutched at her temples, her vision blurring at the edges. The darkness pulsed, each throb resonating with the beat of her own terrified heart. It wasn't just inside her head. It was reaching out, wrapping tendrils of dread around her limbs, trying to paralyze her. She forced herself to stand, shaking off the phantom touch. This wasn't about surviving. It was about ending it. The entity intensified its assault. The silence of the void was suddenly filled with a deafening roar, a symphony of all the cinema's past horrors. The creak of unseen footsteps, the guttural snarls of phantom beasts from 1,000 forgotten films, the desperate pleas of imagined victims. It was trying to overwhelm her, to drown her in a tidal wave of sensory overload. Blood trickled from her nose, warm and metallic on her lip. Her ears rang, a high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter her eardrums. She felt her sanity fraying, threads snapping one by one, threatening to unravel her completely. This wasn't a monster to be punched or shot. It was an infection of the mind, a cancer of the soul. Chen knew she couldn't fight it with conventional means. Her agent power lay in fear, in despair, in the silent, creeping dread it had cultivated for decades. To defeat it, she had to starve it. Or perhaps to choke it. A desperate, insane idea began to form in her mind. It fed on suffering. What if she offered it a feast so vast, so overwhelming, that it couldn't possibly consume it all? What if she became the conduit for all its accumulated agony, not to be destroyed by it, but to force it back onto itself? She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to scream. She focused, not on resisting the pain, but on embracing it. She opened herself up, a raw, exposed nerve, to every single tendril of fear, every flicker of despair, every shard of agony the entity threw at her. The effect was instantaneous and excruciating. It was as if every cell in her body was simultaneously being torn apart and reassembled, twisted into impossible shapes. The memories of fear became her own. The screams became her voice. The despair became the very air in her lungs. She felt the entity surge into her, a cold, black tide, trying to consume her utterly. This was the sacrifice, to become the vessel for its torment, to willingly endure a suffering that would surely break any ordinary human. Her muscles spasmed violently, her teeth grinding so hard she feared they would shatter. She dropped to her knees, convulsing, every nerve ending aflame. She was drowning in pure, unadulterated suffering. But she didn't break. A guard within that maelstrom of agony, a tiny spark of defiance flickered. It was the stubborn, unyielding will that had brought her here. The refusal to let this thing continue. She held on, not by fighting back, but by holding. She became a dam, not against the tide, but for the tide, forcing it to flow through her, to bottleneck, to choke on its own immensity. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound, but a ripping of the fabric of reality itself. It had expected her to shatter, to become another morsel. Instead, she was holding its very essence, containing it, refusing to let it spread. The blackness around her began to writhe, not with malevolence, but with a frantic, desperate energy. It was trying to pull away, to escape the self-inflicted wound. Chen gasped, a ragged, raw sound. Her vision returned, swimming with stars and phantom light. The vortex of darkness was contracting, shrinking, its immense pressure turning inward. It was like watching a black hole collapse in on itself, not into nothingness, but into a painful, concentrated point. She pushed, with every fiber of her being, with the last vestiges of her strength, forcing the entity to internalize its own power, to consume itself. The agony in her own body was unimaginable, but it was receding, slowly, painfully, as the entity's grip weakened. A figure of final shattering psychic scream that echoed only in her mind. The darkness imploded. A person with a bang, but with a sickening, wet slurp, leaving behind only the profound, empty silence of the sub-basement. Chen collapsed, her body a trembling, aching mess. Her mind was a landscape of scorched earth, but it was her own. She was utterly broken, her spirit scarred beyond repair. But she was alive, and the core of the entity, the black heart of the old cinema, was gone. The cold, damp air in the sub-basement of the old cinema didn't just carry the scent of mildew and decay. It hummed with a deeper, more insidious chill. Now, however, that hum had faded. A profound, almost unbearable silence had descended, thick and suffocating. Chen lay slumped against a crumbling brick wall, the metallic tang of blood a faint echo on her tongue, her entire body screaming with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. The confrontation had not been a battle of fists or blades, but a war waged in the dark corridors of the mind, a relentless assault on her very sanity. The entity, a formless malignancy woven from the theater's darkest memories and forgotten fears, had sought to consume her, to make her another lost whisper in its echoing domain. Chen had fought back not with force, but with a desperate primal refusal to break. She had clung to the frayed edges of her identity, screaming defiance into the void it tried to carve within her, until, with a final shuddering tremor that vibrated through the very foundations of the building, it had receded. It hadn't been vanquished, not truly. It had merely retreated, a predatory tide pulling back from a shore too stubborn to yield. The air no longer vibrated with its presence, yet Chen felt its absence like a phantom limb, an ache where something terrible had been. Her head throbbed, a dull drumbeat against her temples, and her vision swam, the shadows in the sub-basement seeming to writhe and stretch with a life of their own. She pushed herself up, every muscle protesting, her knees threatening to buckle. The flashlight, dropped during the final desperate moments, lay nearby, its beam a sickly yellow stain on the grimy concrete. She retrieved it, her hand trembling so violently she almost dropped it again. As she moved through the sub-basement, the silence pressed in, no longer merely the absence of sound, but an active, malevolent entity in itself. It was the silence of a tomb, of a place where something had died, but not truly departed. Every creak of the old pipes, every distant murmur of the building settling felt amplified, distorted. She found herself flinching at innocuous sounds, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear wasn't gone. It had merely shape-shifted, burrowing deep beneath her skin. A colleague the stairs, she ascended slowly, each step a monumental effort. The annex above was just as she had left it. Dust motes dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy windows, forgotten props shrouded in white sheets, rows of empty seats waiting for an audience that would never come. But it was different. The oppressive gloom that had always clung to the place now felt thinner, yet more insidious. The air didn't hum with dread, but it felt heavy, laden with the residue of something unspeakable. The annex was silent, yes, but forever scarred. The very walls seemed to whisper secrets, not of the entity itself, but of the terror it had inflicted, the fear it had siphoned. Chen reached the main lobby, the grand, faded space feeling vast and empty. The ornate plasterwork on the ceiling seemed to leer, the faces carved into the pilasters twisted into silent screams. She knew with a chilling certainty that she was irrevocably changed. The experience in the sub-basement had not merely traumatized her, it had rewired her very perception of reality. The world, once a solid, predictable place, now felt porous, thin. She saw things in the periphery of her vision, fleeting shadows, distortions in the air, that vanished when she tried to focus. She heard whispers in the wind, felt cold spots in warm rooms. The deep trauma of her experience was a constant companion, a lead weight in her chest. An agent offered no escape, only fragmented nightmares that bled into her waking hours. She found herself scrutinizing ordinary objects, searching for the telltale signs of the unseen, the subtle shifts that betrayed a hidden presence. She was no longer just Chen, the woman who had sought answers in an old cinema. She was Chen, the woman who had looked into the abyss and found that the abyss had looked back and left a piece of itself behind. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the entity was not truly gone. It was merely dormant, its influence a subtle poison seeping into her perception, altering the very fabric of her world. The horror lingered, not as a monstrous presence she could fight, but as a silent, insidious truth that had permanently altered her. She was now attuned to the frequencies of dread, a reluctant receiver of the world's hidden terrors. The old cinema was quiet, but for Chen, the echoes would remain, a constant, chilling reminder that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. And some horrors, once glimpsed, could never truly be forgotten.